Richard stands frozen in the studio doorway, his face purple with rage. Eleanor's paint-stained hands tremble as Darius steps protectively beside her. 12 years of lies shatter like glass. "You've been sleeping with the pool boy?" Richard spits. Eleanor lifts her chin. "I've been finding myself. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. A stranger's touch can rewrite everything you thought you knew about Desire. She had the perfect life, the perfect marriage, the perfect control, until the day a man with hands made for hard work looked at her like she was the only thing worth seeing. What starts as a desperate attempt to feel alive again becomes something neither of them can walk away from. But in a world that judges them before they even speak, can forbidden passion survive the weight of everyone's expectations? And when her carefully constructed world begins to crack, will she choose the safety of what she knows, or the dangerous truth of what she needs? The June sun blazed mercilessly over the sprawling estate in Bel Air, turning the Spanish tile roof into a shimmering mirage. Inside the main house, Eleanor Montgomery stood at her bedroom window, watching a figure move with easy grace around the pool below. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who looked every bit the part she played, blonde hair styled in perfect waves, designer dress hugging a body maintained through personal trainers and careful diets, skin kept youthful through expensive treatments. At 42, she was everything her husband Richard wanted her to be, a beautiful accessory to his success. The man below bent to test the pool's chemical levels, his dark skin glistening with sweat in the afternoon heat. Darius Washington had been maintaining their pool for 3 weeks now, ever since the previous service had been let go. Eleanor had noticed him that first day, noticed the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way his muscles shifted beneath his skin as he worked, the way he seemed completely unbothered by the obvious wealth surrounding him. She noticed other things too, like how he never looked away first when their eyes met, how his smile seemed genuine rather than the practiced pleasantries she was used to, how he treated the gardens and pool with a care that suggested he actually valued the work he did. Richard's voice echoed up from his home office, sharp and demanding as he spoke to someone on the phone. Eleanor could hear the edge in his tone, the one that had become more common over the past 5 years of their 12-year marriage. The edge that said he was important, powerful, not to be questioned. She turned away from the window, smoothing her dress with hands that had nothing useful to do anymore. The house was too quiet. Their housekeeper had the day off, and Richard wouldn't emerge from his office until late evening. Eleanor descended the curved staircase, her heels clicking against marble that had been imported from Italy at Richard's insistence. Everything in this house was at Richard's insistence. The art on the walls, chosen by his decorator. The furniture, selected to impress his business associates. Even the flowers in the vases were changed twice weekly to match whatever aesthetic Richard's designer deemed appropriate for the season. She found herself walking toward the French doors that led to the pool area, drawn by something she couldn't name. The heat hit her immediately as she stepped outside, wrapping around her like a physical presence. Darius was crouched near the equipment shed, his back to her as he organized chemicals and tools with methodical precision. "Darius," she called out, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, too formal, too controlled. He turned, and for a moment the sun was directly behind him, turning him into a silhouette of pure masculine form. Then he moved, and she could see his face, see the way his eyes took her in without judgment, without the coldness she'd grown accustomed to from Richard. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, his voice deep and warm. "Is everything all right with the pool?" Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure slip just slightly. She'd had no reason to come out here, no actual problem to report. She was a woman who never did anything without purpose, and yet here she stood. "I noticed the water seemed a bit cloudy yesterday," she improvised, walking closer. "Though it looks clear enough now." Darius stood, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. The movement drew her eyes to his waist, to the way his work pants sat on his hips, to the strength evident in every line of his body. She forced her gaze back to his face. "I adjusted the chemicals this morning," he said, moving to stand beside her at the pool's edge. "Should be crystal clear by tomorrow." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "You've got good eyes to notice the difference." The compliment was simple, probably meant as nothing more than pleasant conversation, but it hit Eleanor with unexpected force. When was the last time Richard had really looked at her, noticed anything about her beyond whether her appearance met his standards. When had anyone seen her as more than an ornament? "You take pride in your work," she said, watching his reflection in the pool's surface. "I can tell." Darius glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. "Only way I know how to be, Mrs. Montgomery. If something's worth doing, it's worth doing right." They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them charged with an awareness Eleanor hadn't felt in years. She could smell chlorine and sunshine and something else, something uniquely him, clean sweat and honest work. "Eleanor," she said suddenly. "You can call me Eleanor." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw real acknowledgement there, not the careful neutrality of service worker to employer, but man to woman. "Eleanor," he repeated, and the way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. "That's a beautiful name." She should walk away. Every rule of propriety, every expectation of her position, every voice of reason in her head told her to go back inside, to maintain the proper distance between employer and employee. But she found herself asking instead, "How long have you been in the pool business?" Darius leaned against one of the pool chairs, an easy posture that somehow didn't seem disrespectful. "About 8 years now. Started working for a company right out of high school, learned everything I could, then struck out on my own about 3 years ago." "That must take courage," Eleanor said, surprised to find herself genuinely interested. "Starting your own business." He shrugged, but she could see the pride in his eyes. "Scary as hell if I'm being honest. But working for someone else, always feeling like you're building their dream instead of your own. It wears on you after a while. Had to at least try to make something that was mine." Eleanor understood that feeling more than he could know. How many dreams had she set aside to become Richard's wife, to fit into the life he'd constructed? She'd been an art student once, passionate about painting, about creating something meaningful. That girl felt like a stranger now, buried under years of country club luncheons and charity galas where she smiled and nodded and never said anything that mattered. The sound of Richard's voice carried through an open window, loud and aggressive. Eleanor flinched slightly before she could stop herself. Darius noticed, his eyes sharpening with something that might have been concern. "Your husband's a busy man," he said carefully, the words a polite fiction they both understood. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice flat. "Very busy." Another silence stretched between them, but this one felt different, weighted with unspoken understanding. Darius looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, like he was seeing past the perfect exterior to something real underneath. "The pool looks beautiful," Eleanor said finally, breaking the moment before it could become something she wasn't ready for. "Thank you for your attention to detail." She turned to go, and his voice stopped her. "Eleanor," he said, and she looked back. "If you ever need anything at all, I'm here Tuesdays and Thursdays. Rain or shine." The words were simple, professional even, but the way he looked at her when he said them made heat bloom in her chest, spread through her body in ways she'd forgotten were possible. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked back toward the house on legs that felt unsteady. Inside, the air conditioning hit her like a cold slap. Eleanor pressed her back against the door, her heart racing for more than just the heat. This was ridiculous. She was a married woman, a woman of status and position. Darius Washington was her pool maintenance worker, and that moment by the pool, whatever it had been, couldn't happen again. But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. Because for the first time in years, she'd felt seen. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she'd felt something other than numb. Upstairs, she could hear Richard still on his phone call, his voice sharp with criticism for whoever had displeased him. Eleanor looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror, seeing the perfect makeup, the perfect hair, the perfect emptiness in her eyes. 2 more days until Thursday, she thought, and then immediately hated herself for thinking it. The next 48 hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Eleanor found herself going through the motions of her daily routine with even less enthusiasm than usual. Wednesday morning brought her weekly tennis lesson at the country club, where she mechanically hit balls while her instructor offered encouragement she didn't need. Lunch was with the other wives, women who spoke in careful code about their dissatisfactions while never quite admitting to them. Eleanor listened to Margaret Hartwell complain about her husband's long hours, to Susan Chen discuss her personal trainer with an enthusiasm that seemed to have nothing to do with fitness, To Catherine Morrison drop hints about mysterious spa appointments that left her glowing. They were all playing the same game. Eleanor realized as she sipped her sparkling water and picked at her salad. All pretending their lives were perfect, while quietly seeking satisfaction anywhere they could find it. The realization made her feel both less alone and more trapped. That evening, Richard came home late again, smelling of expensive scotch and his secretary's perfume. He kissed Eleanor's cheek with the same passion he might have shown a business associate, barely looking at her as he recounted his day's triumphs. Eleanor listened with practiced interest, making appropriate sounds at appropriate moments, while inside she felt like she was disappearing. In bed that night, Richard reached for her with the entitled assumption of a man who'd never been refused. Eleanor responded mechanically, her body going through familiar motions while her mind drifted elsewhere. She thought about strong hands scarred from honest work, about eyes that saw her instead of through her, about a voice that said her name like it mattered. Richard finished quickly, as he always did, rolling away without a word before falling into heavy sleep within minutes. Eleanor stared at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to her husband snore, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. Thursday morning arrived with that particular quality of light that promised scorching heat later. Eleanor changed her outfit 3 times before settling on white linen pants and a silk blouse, telling herself she wasn't dressing for anyone in particular, even as she applied her makeup with extra care. She was downstairs brewing coffee when she heard the familiar rumble of Darius's truck in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she watched him unload his equipment, moving with that same easy confidence she'd noticed before. He wore different clothes today, cargo shorts that showed off powerful legs and a fitted tank top that did nothing to hide his physique. Eleanor gripped her coffee mug tighter, trying to ignore the way her pulse had quickened. She forced herself to stay inside for the first hour, busying herself with meaningless tasks. She reorganized the already organized pantry, responded to emails about charity events she didn't care about, flipped through a decorating magazine without seeing any of the pages. Finally, unable to resist any longer, she walked out to the pool carrying a pitcher of iced tea and 2 glasses. Darius was kneeling by the filter system when she approached, his attention completely absorbed in his work. She cleared her throat, and he looked up, something like pleased surprise crossing his face before he schooled it into professional neutrality. "Thought you might like something cold," Eleanor said, setting the pitcher on a nearby table. "It's brutal out here today." He stood, accepting the glass she poured with a grateful nod. "That's real kind of you. Most people don't think about that sort of thing." They stood in the shade of a large umbrella, sipping their tea in comfortable silence. Eleanor noticed details she'd missed before, the way his eyelashes were surprisingly long for a man, the slight scar on his left forearm, the gentleness of his hands despite their obvious strength. "How did you get into this work?" she found herself asking. "Was it always pools?" Darius smiled at the question. "No. Started out wanting to be an engineer, believe it or not. Got a scholarship to UCLA, studied mechanical engineering for 2 years. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "What happened?" "My mom got sick," he said simply. "Cancer. Needed someone to take care of her, help with the bills. I was the oldest, so I dropped out. Started working whatever jobs I could find. Pools paid better than most, and I was good at it. By the time Mom passed, I'd built up enough of a client base that going back to school didn't make sense anymore." "I'm sorry about your mother," Eleanor said softly. That must have been incredibly hard. He shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. "She raised me by herself after my dad left when I was 6. Worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. Taking care of her when she needed me, that was the least I could do." The simple devotion in his words made Eleanor's chest tighten. She tried to imagine Richard sacrificing anything for anyone, and couldn't. Her husband's world revolved around Richard, always had, always would. "She sounds like an amazing woman," Eleanor said. "She was," Darius agreed, his voice warm with memory. "Used to tell me that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of, that how you did something mattered more than what you were doing. Said a man's character showed in how he treated people who couldn't do nothing for him." Eleanor thought about the way Richard treated waiters, valets, anyone he deemed beneath him. Thought about the casual cruelty he showed to people who existed only to serve his needs. "Your mother was wise," she said quietly. Darius looked at her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see too much. "What about you, Eleanor?" You always live in a place like this? The question was bold, crossing the invisible line between them. But Eleanor found she wanted to answer honestly. No, she said, surprised by her own candor. I grew up in a small town in Oregon. My father was a teacher. My mother worked at the library. Our house would have fit in this pool cabana. She looked around at the excessive display of wealth surrounding them, the marble and perfectly manicured gardens and furniture that cost more than some people's cars. I was studying art at Berkeley when I met Richard, she continued. He was getting his MBA, seemed so sophisticated and worldly. I thought I was moving up in the world, becoming someone important. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turns out I was just trading one kind of small for another. The words hung between them, more honest than she'd been with anyone in years. Darius didn't respond immediately, just looked at her with an understanding that made something crack in her carefully maintained armor. I should let you get back to work, Eleanor said, suddenly feeling exposed by her confession. Richard will be home early today. He has clients coming for drinks this evening. She turned to go, and Darius's voice stopped her, just as it had 2 days before. Eleanor, he said, and the way he said her name made her heart race. Don't lose yourself completely. The world's got enough empty, beautiful things in it. She looked back at him, finding his gaze steady and serious. Nobody had spoken to her that way in so long, seen her clearly enough to know she needed to hear those words. Without thinking, she closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps. Later, she wouldn't be able to say who moved first, whose hand reached out, whose breath caught. But suddenly they were standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell sweat and chlorine and something uniquely him that made her dizzy. His hand came up, stopping just short of touching her face, hovering there as if held back by invisible barriers of propriety and consequence. Eleanor could see the war in his eyes, desire fighting with respect, wanting fighting with knowing better. We can't, he said, his voice rough. You know we can't. Eleanor knew he was right, knew that crossing this line would be catastrophic, would destroy the careful order of her life, would create complications she couldn't begin to imagine. And yet, standing there in the blazing sun with this man who saw her, really saw her, she found herself not caring about consequences for the first time in her adult life. I know, she whispered, but she didn't step back. Neither did he. The moment stretched between them, taut as a wire. Darius's hand still hovered near her face, trembling slightly with the effort of not touching her. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel every nerve in her body singing with awareness. The sound of a car on the gravel driveway shattered the spell. Eleanor jerked backward, reality crashing down on her like cold water. Richard's Mercedes was pulling up to the house, hours earlier than expected. I have to go, she said, her voice shaking. Her hands smoothed down her blouse automatically, erasing invisible wrinkles, rebuilding the armor of perfection. Darius nodded, stepping back into the role of professional poolman with impressive speed. His eyes, though, still held heat, still held recognition of what had almost happened. Eleanor walked back toward the house on unsteady legs, forcing her face into the pleasant mask of the perfect wife. Richard emerged from his car just as she reached the patio, barely glancing at her as he barked into his phone about merger details and stock options. She turned to look back once, finding Darius kneeling by the pool, apparently absorbed in his work. But as if feeling her gaze, he looked up, and their eyes met across the impossible distance between them. Everything Eleanor had felt in that charged moment came rushing back, stronger than before, refusing to be ignored or rationalized away. Richard was still talking, oblivious as always to anything beyond his own concerns. Eleanor followed him into the house, into the air-conditioned perfection of her prison, while outside the sun beat down on a man who'd made her feel alive for the first time in years. That evening passed in a blur of entertaining Richard's clients, playing the role of gracious hostess with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything else. She smiled and laughed at appropriate moments, made sure drinks stayed filled and canapés kept coming, discussed safe topics like the weather and recent charity events, all while her mind remained outside by the pool, replaying those charged moments over and over. The clients finally left around midnight. Richard kissed her cheek absently, already heading to his office to review documents that apparently couldn't wait until morning. Eleanor climbed the stairs to their bedroom alone, as she did most nights, and stood once more at the window overlooking the pool. The water gleamed silver in the moonlight, perfectly clear and still. She could see the spot where she and Darius had stood, where she'd almost thrown away everything for a moment of genuine feeling. The smart thing would be to call the pool service tomorrow, request a different maintenance worker. The smart thing would be to erase Darius Washington from her life before things got any more complicated. But Eleanor was tired of being smart, tired of being perfect, tired of slowly disappearing into the role everyone expected her to play. Next Tuesday, Darius would return, and Eleanor knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that when he did, she wouldn't send him away. Whatever was starting between them, whatever dangerous fire they were playing with, she wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. The weekend stretched ahead, 2 more days of pretending everything was fine. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching her breath fog the window, and wondered how much longer she could keep living a lie. Downstairs, Richard's voice echoed through the house, confident and commanding as always. Up here in the darkness, Eleanor closed her eyes and remembered a different voice, saying her name like it mattered, looking at her like she was worth seeing. The choice ahead of her seemed impossible. But deep down, in a place she'd forgotten existed, Eleanor knew she'd already made it. The weekend arrived with its usual parade of obligations. Saturday brought the Westlake Country Club tournament, where Eleanor sat in the shade sipping mimosas, while Richard networked with potential investors on the golf course. She smiled and nodded through conversations about vacation homes and designer handbags, her mind wandering to strong hands and honest eyes. Sunday meant brunch at the Morrison estate, hours of careful small talk where every word was calculated, every appearance managed. Through it all, Eleanor felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, going through motions that meant nothing. She saw herself laugh at jokes that weren't funny, saw herself touch Richard's arm with false affection when his business partners were watching, saw herself play the role of devoted wife with the skill of someone who'd been practicing for 12 years. Monday morning, Richard announced he'd be flying to San Francisco for meetings, wouldn't be back until Wednesday night. Eleanor felt relief flood through her, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved. She waved goodbye from the doorway as his driver loaded his luggage, then stood in the sudden silence of the empty house. The pool gleamed in the morning sun, and Eleanor found herself drawn to it, walking the perimeter slowly. She could still feel the ghost of that moment with Darius, the electricity that had arced between them, the weight of possibility hanging in the air. Tomorrow he would return, and she would have to decide what she wanted, who she wanted to be. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She wandered through the massive house, room after room of expensive emptiness. In Richard's study, she looked at the framed photos on his desk, their wedding day, various charity events. The two of them posed in front of landmarks during trips where they'd barely spoken. In every picture, her smile was perfect, and her eyes were dead. She found herself in the room that was supposed to be her art studio, the space Richard had promised her when they first moved in. It was filled now with his overflow paperwork, boxes of old files he refused to throw away. Her easels and paints had been relegated to a closet years ago. Eleanor opened that closet now, pulling out canvases covered in dust, seeing the ghost of the woman she used to be. There was a painting of the Oregon coast, all wild rocks and crashing waves, painted during her last year of college. Another of her mother's garden, vibrant with life. A self-portrait she'd started and never finished, the eyes still blank, waiting to be filled in. Eleanor traced her fingers over the dried paint, remembering the passion she'd once felt, the certainty that art was her purpose, her voice, her truth. When had she stopped painting? When had she stopped being herself? The answer came unbidden. The day she married Richard Montgomery and became the woman he needed her to be. Eleanor carried the unfinished self-portrait to the window, studying it in the moonlight. The woman in the painting looked so young, so full of possibility. Eleanor barely recognized her. She thought about Darius's mother, working 2 jobs to give her son a better life. Thought about Darius himself, giving up his dreams to take care of her. They had sacrificed out of love, out of duty to something bigger than themselves. What had Eleanor sacrificed for? A big house? Social status? The approval of people she didn't even like? Tuesday morning dawned clear and hot. Eleanor woke early, her heart racing with anticipation and anxiety. She chose her clothes carefully, a sundress that was casual but flattering, nothing obvious but nothing dowdy either. She was in the kitchen when she heard Darius's truck pull up, and she had to grip the counter to steady herself. She watched from the window as he unloaded his equipment, her pulse pounding. He moved with that same easy grace, completely focused on his work, and Eleanor realized she was gripping the counter hard enough to hurt her hands. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling through her. An hour passed. Eleanor tried to occupy herself with meaningless tasks, but she couldn't focus on anything. Finally, she poured 2 glasses of lemonade and walked outside, her legs trembling slightly with each step. Darius was testing the pool's pH levels, bent over his equipment with complete concentration. He straightened when he heard her approach, and their eyes met. The impact of his gaze hit Eleanor like a physical force, stealing her breath. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice carefully neutral, but she could see the awareness in his eyes, the memory of what had almost happened hanging between them. "Morning," she replied, holding out one of the glasses. "I thought you might be thirsty." He accepted the lemonade, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The brief contact sent electricity up Eleanor's arm, and from the way Darius's eyes darkened, she knew he felt it too. They stood in silence, sipping their drinks, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Eleanor could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Every nerve in her body seemed tuned to Darius's presence, acutely aware of the distance between them, the heat radiating from his skin. "Your husband away on business?" Darius asked finally, his tone casual but his eyes intense. "San Francisco," Eleanor confirmed. "Until Wednesday." The implication hung in the air. They were alone, completely alone. No witnesses, no interruptions, no Richard to come home early. "Eleanor," Darius started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "Last week, what almost happened, we need to talk about it." "Do we?" Eleanor heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or do we need to stop pretending we don't both want it to happen?" The boldness of her own words shocked her, but she didn't take them back. Couldn't take them back. She was tired of pretending, tired of being careful, tired of living a half-life of careful manners and empty days. Darius set down his glass with deliberate care, his jaw tight. "You're married," he said quietly. "I work for you. This is a bad idea on about 10 different levels." "I know," Eleanor replied, stepping closer. "I know it's complicated. I know all the reasons we shouldn't. But for once in my life, I want to do something because it feels right, not because it's what I'm supposed to do." She was close enough now to see the pulse beating in his throat, to feel the tension radiating from his body, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and she could see the war playing out in his eyes. "What do you want from me, Eleanor?" His voice was rough, strained. "You want me to make this easy for you? To be the one who crosses the line so you can tell yourself it wasn't your choice?" The accusation stung because there was truth in it, but Eleanor shook her head, meeting his gaze steadily. "No," she said. "I want you to see me. Really see me. I want to feel something real for once. I want to stop being invisible in my own life." She reached out, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. His skin was warm through the thin fabric of his shirt, solid and real in a way nothing in her life had been for years. "I see you," Darius said quietly, his hand coming up to cover hers. "I see you, Eleanor. That's the problem. I see exactly who you are, and that makes this even more complicated." "Then stop fighting it," Eleanor whispered. "Please. Just for today, stop fighting what we both feel." For a long moment, Darius didn't move, didn't speak. Then, with a sound that might have been surrender or defeat, he pulled her against him. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and Eleanor felt something inside her crack open, years of loneliness and longing pouring out. She tilted her face up to his, and when his lips finally met hers, it felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff all at once. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if they were both testing the reality of this moment. Then Darius's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone, and the tenderness of the gesture undid her completely. Eleanor pressed closer, her hands sliding up his chest to wind around his neck. Darius groaned softly, deepening the kiss, and she could taste his hunger, his need, matching her own. His other hand slid to her waist, pulling her flush against him, and Eleanor could feel the heat of his body burning through the thin fabric of her dress. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Darius pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closed. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "You know that, right? There's no going back from this." Eleanor knew he was right, knew that this moment would divide her life into before and after, knew that she was stepping off a ledge with no idea if there would be anything to catch her fall. But as she stood in Darius's arms, feeling more alive than she had in years, she found she didn't care about the fall. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "I can't go back to being invisible. Not now. Not after this." Darius pulled back slightly, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then we don't go back," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The promise in his words, the certainty in his voice, made tears spring to Eleanor's eyes. When was the last time anyone had offered to face anything with her? When had anyone looked at her and seen someone worth standing beside? She kissed him again, pouring all her gratitude and need and desperate hope into it. Darius responded with equal fervor, his hands moving over her back, her waist, mapping the contours of her body with reverent attention. Eleanor felt desired in a way she'd forgotten was possible, seen in a way she'd thought she'd lost forever. They stood there in the blazing sun, wrapped in each other, while around them the perfect, empty estate bore silent witness to the moment everything changed. The days that followed existed in a space outside of time, a bubble of stolen moments and dangerous truth. Eleanor and Darius moved carefully at first, each touch still feeling like a transgression, each kiss weighted with the knowledge of what they were risking. But slowly, inevitably, careful gave way to consuming. Wednesday afternoon found them in the pool house, a space Richard never entered. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, painting patterns across Darius's skin as Eleanor traced the lines of his shoulders, memorizing every detail. "Tell me about your dreams," she whispered. "The ones you gave up. Used to imagine building bridges," he said quietly. "Not just any bridges, but ones that could span impossible distances. Figured if I could learn the math and physics of it, I could connect places that seemed too far apart to ever touch." "You still could," Eleanor said. "It's not too late." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Different life, Eleanor. Different world. I made my choices and I don't regret them. Taking care of my mama, that mattered more than any bridge I could have built." "What about you?" Darius asked. "What did you dream about before all this?" "I wanted to paint," Eleanor said softly. "Wanted to say something true with color and canvas. Thought I could make people see the world differently." "Why'd you stop?" "Because Richard didn't need an artist for a wife," Eleanor replied. "He needed a showpiece. Someone who looked good at parties and didn't ask complicated questions. So I put away my paints and learned to be what he wanted." "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard," Darius said quietly. His simple honesty broke something open in Eleanor. She found herself telling him everything. About the slow death of her identity over 12 years of marriage. About the loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who never really saw her. About the desperate hunger for something real, something that made her feel like a person instead of an object. "You're not invisible, Eleanor," Darius said firmly. "I see you. Every part of you. The artist hiding inside the perfect wife. I see all of it, and it's beautiful." No one had spoken to Eleanor that way in so long that she couldn't stop the tears that came. Darius held her while she cried, his presence steady and undemanding. When the tears finally stopped, Eleanor felt lighter somehow, as if releasing that pain had created space for something new. They made love slowly, carefully, Darius treating her like something precious rather than something owed to him. He learned her body with patient attention, discovering what made her gasp, what made her arch against him, what made her forget everything except this moment, this extraordinary feeling of being completely present in her own skin. Afterward, lying in the golden afternoon light, Eleanor traced the scar on Darius's forearm. "How'd you get this?" "Pool equipment accident my first year," he said. "Filter housing exploded while I was working on it." Eleanor pressed her lips to the scar. "Every mark tells a story," she murmured. "Every scar is proof you survived something." The sound of a car door slamming made them both freeze. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she recognized Richard's Mercedes. He wasn't supposed to be home until evening. But here he was, hours early. Eleanor and Darius moved with silent urgency, finding their scattered clothes. Eleanor's hands shook as she buttoned her dress. Darius touched her face gently, his eyes steady and calm. "Breathe," he said quietly. "Just breathe. I'll go back to the pool, finish my work like normal. You go inside, be the wife he expects. We can do this." Eleanor nodded, leaning into his touch for one more moment before pulling away and hurrying toward the main house. She entered through the kitchen just as Richard came in the front door, already barking into his phone. Eleanor caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror, flushed skin, slightly mussed hair. She ducked into the powder room, splashing cold water on her face. When she emerged, Richard was pouring himself scotch. "Meeting's wrapped early," he said, scrolling through his phone. "I need to shower and change. The Hendersons are meeting us at Maestro's at 7. Eleanor had forgotten about the dinner. "Of course," she said automatically. "I'll be ready." Richard finally looked at her. "You look flushed. You feeling all right?" "Just the heat," Eleanor replied. "I was outside checking on the pool maintenance." "Speaking of which," Richard said, glancing toward the window where Darius was visible, "we need to talk about that service. I've been hearing things at the club." "What kind of things?" "Apparently that company has a reputation. The owner is black, and he tends to hire people like him. The Cranstons let him go last month." The casual racism in Richard's tone made Eleanor's hands clench. "The work is excellent," she said carefully. "The pool has never looked better." Richard shrugged. "Fine, keep him for now. But if I start hearing gossip," he goes. He headed upstairs, leaving Eleanor shaking with anger and shame. Through the window, she could see Darius packing up. Their eyes met across the distance, and even from here she could see the understanding in his gaze. That evening at Maestro's was torture. Eleanor smiled and laughed at appropriate moments, while inside she felt like she was dying. All she could think about was Darius. The way he'd held her like she mattered. The way he'd listened as if her dreams were important. The way he'd made her feel seen and valued and real. Across the table, Richard held court, telling stories designed to showcase his brilliance. Eleanor watched her husband with detached clarity, seeing him perhaps for the first time as he truly was. Self-centered. Shallow. Incapable of genuine connection. Had she ever loved him? Or had she just been dazzled by his confidence, by the life he could provide? The girl she'd been at 22 had been so eager to become someone new. She'd thought marrying Richard would transform her into something better. Instead, it had nearly erased her completely. The next 2 weeks passed in careful balance. Eleanor painted every day, building her portfolio. She had video calls with Maya, her old college friend who ran a gallery in Portland, scheduling a show for 3 months out. During the day, she was the perfect wife. But in stolen hours, she painted her truth, built the foundation that would let her walk away. And twice a week, when Darius came to service the pool, they stole moments together. Sometimes just talking, sometimes making love with desperate urgency, always reminding each other that what they felt was real, was worth fighting for. Eleanor knew it couldn't last. She just didn't expect it to happen the way it did. It was a Thursday afternoon in October. Richard had said he'd be at the office until late. Darius was in Eleanor's studio watching her paint. Neither heard Richard's car. Neither knew anything was wrong until the studio door flew open and Richard stood there, his face purple with rage. Eleanor stood at her easel, brush in hand. Darius stood beside her, close enough that their relationship was obvious. "What the hell is this?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. "This is me painting, Richard," Eleanor said steadily. "Something I used to do before I married you and forgot who I was." Richard's eyes moved from Eleanor to Darius, then to the canvases. "You," he pointed at Darius, shaking with fury. "Get out of my house. Now." Darius looked at Eleanor, silently asking if she wanted him to stay. Eleanor took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Darius is going to leave because I'm asking him to, not because you're ordering him. And then you and I are going to have a conversation that's 12 years overdue." Richard laughed bitterly. "You think you're in a position to make demands? Everything you have exists because of me." Eleanor set down her brush. "No, Richard. I'm a person who made the mistake of marrying a man who only values things he can own and control. and I'm done being one of your possessions." She turned to Darius. "I'll call you later." Darius hesitated, but Eleanor nodded, and he left. When they were alone, Richard moved closer. "You've been sleeping with him. The pool boy. How pathetic." "I've been finding myself," Eleanor replied, "remembering what it feels like to be seen as a person rather than a trophy. And yes, I've fallen in love with a man who treats me with more respect in an afternoon than you've shown me in 12 years. You want a divorce? Fine, but I'll destroy you, Eleanor. You'll get nothing. Everyone will know what you've been doing. Do what you need to do, Richard, but I'm leaving either way. I'd rather have nothing and be free than have everything and be your prisoner." "You've changed," Richard said, confusion in his voice. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "I've remembered who I was before you convinced me to be someone else. And that woman isn't coming back. The divorce was brutal." Expensive lawyers painted Eleanor as unfaithful. The country club whispered. Friends abandoned her. But Eleanor had Maya, who flew down to support her. She had Darius, who never wavered. And she had her art, which became more powerful as she poured her pain onto canvas. The gallery show happened in December. Eleanor stood nervously as people viewed her work. The paintings showed her journey from empty perfection to raw honesty to fierce hope. Darius stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. The show was small, but as people responded to her work, she felt satisfaction deeper than anything her old life had provided. "You sold 6 pieces," Maya said. "For a first show, that's incredible." Eleanor felt tears of genuine joy. "I did it," she whispered. The divorce finalized in February. Eleanor walked out with almost nothing material, but she had her freedom, her art, and a small apartment rented with money from her paintings. Darius waited outside. Eleanor went to him, letting him wrap her in his arms. "It's over," she said. "It's finally over." "No," Darius corrected gently. "It's finally beginning." The apartment Eleanor now called home was a studio in an older building downtown, nothing like the mansion she'd left behind. The walls needed paint, the floors creaked, and the kitchen was barely big enough for one person. But when Eleanor unlocked the door and stepped inside with Darius following, she felt something she'd never felt in Richard's perfectly decorated estate. She felt home. "Look," Darius said, walking to the large window that overlooked the city. "You've got amazing light in here. Perfect for painting." Eleanor joined him, seeing the afternoon sun streaming through the glass, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. She imagined setting up her easel right there, capturing the city skyline at different times of day, painting the truth of ordinary life instead of the manufactured perfection she'd been surrounded by for so long. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning to face him. "For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself." Darius cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the strength in those work-worn fingers. "You did the hard part, Eleanor. You chose yourself. You chose freedom. I just got lucky enough to be there when you did." That night, they made love in Eleanor's new space, on the floor because she didn't have a bed yet, wrapped in borrowed blankets. And somehow it felt more intimate, more real than any moment in the mansion's luxurious bedroom ever had. This was honest. This was chosen. This was love without pretense or performance. The next weeks were harder than Eleanor had anticipated. She'd known leaving Richard would mean financial struggle, but the reality of it hit differently than the theory. She learned to budget carefully, to shop at thrift stores instead of boutiques, to cook simple meals instead of having everything prepared for her. She took a part-time job at Maya's gallery in Portland, making the drive 3 times a week, helping with installations and learning the business side of the art world. Some days were overwhelming. Eleanor would stand in the grocery store, paralyzed by the cost of everything, feeling the weight of her choices pressing down. But then she'd come home to her small apartment, to the canvases lining the walls, to the evidence of her own voice finding expression, and she'd remember why it was worth it. Darius was there through all of it, steady as stone. He'd show up with groceries, claiming he'd gotten a deal and bought too much, knowing Eleanor was too proud to accept charity but practical enough to accept sharing. He'd fix things in her apartment, the leaky faucet, the stuck window, the loose floorboard, his hands making her space more livable with quiet competence. One evening in March, Eleanor was working on a new painting, her concentration so complete she didn't hear Darius come in. He'd picked up a key weeks ago, and she loved knowing he could walk in any time, that her space was his space too. "That's powerful," he said, startling her out of her creative trance. Eleanor stepped back to look at what she'd created. The painting showed a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, arms spread wide, either falling or flying. It was impossible to tell which. The colors were bold, almost violent in places, but there was beauty in the chaos. "It's how I felt the day I told Richard I was leaving," Eleanor explained. "Like I was stepping off a ledge with no idea if I'd fall or soar." Darius moved closer, studying the canvas with the same attention he gave to everything Eleanor created. "And which one did you do?" "Both," Eleanor said softly. "I'm still falling and flying all at once." He pulled her against him, and Eleanor leaned into his strength, breathing in the familiar scent of him, chlorine and sun and honest work. In his arms, the falling felt less frightening. The weeks rolled into months, and Eleanor found her rhythm. She painted in the mornings when the light was best, worked at the gallery in the afternoons, spent evenings with Darius when their schedules aligned. It was a simple life, nothing glamorous, but it was hers. Every choice, every moment, every breath was authentically her own. Maya became not just a business connection but a true friend again, the kind Eleanor had lost during her marriage. They'd have coffee before gallery shifts, talking about art and life and the courage it took to start over. Maya never judged Eleanor's choices, never said "I told you so" about Richard, just offered support and opportunities and genuine friendship. "Your work is getting stronger," Maya said one afternoon as they hung Eleanor's pieces for a group show. "More confident. Like you're finally saying what you've been holding back all these years." Eleanor looked at her paintings, seeing the progression even she hadn't fully recognized. The early pieces were tentative, beautiful but careful. The newer work was bold, unapologetic, raw with emotion and truth. She was finding her voice, learning to speak it without fear. That night in Eleanor's modest apartment, she felt more at peace than she ever had in luxury. Darius's arms were strong around her, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "I love you," she said quietly. "Not because you saved me, but because you helped me save myself." "I love you too," he replied. "Every brave, beautiful part of you." Outside, rain began to fall, washing the city clean. Eleanor listened, feeling her old life washing away with it. She'd lost the mansion, the money, the status, the country club friends who'd never really been friends at all. But she'd found herself. Found love that saw her as a person, not a possession. Found purpose and passion and the courage to live authentically, to paint her truth even when it was uncomfortable, to choose freedom over safety. The rain continued through the night, a gentle percussion against the windows that lulled them both towards sleep. But Eleanor found herself awake, watching the play of streetlight and shadow across the ceiling of her small apartment. Darius slept peacefully beside her, one arm draped across her waist, his breathing deep and even. She thought about the year that had passed since that first day at the pool. How much had changed, how much she had changed. The woman who'd stood at her mansion window, watching a stranger work below, felt like someone from another lifetime. That Eleanor had been so careful, so controlled, so desperately empty. This Eleanor, the one lying in a modest apartment with paint under her fingernails and a man who loved her for who she actually was, felt more real than she'd been in decades. She'd traded security for authenticity, and she'd never looked back. Morning came soft and gray, the rain having passed in the night. Eleanor woke to find Darius already up, standing at her small stove making coffee. The domesticity of the moment made her heart swell. This was what partnership looked like, she realized. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but someone making you coffee on a Sunday morning, knowing exactly how you liked it. "Good morning, beautiful," Darius said, turning to smile at her. His hair was slightly mussed from sleep, and he was wearing the shirt he'd had on yesterday, rumpled but somehow perfect. Eleanor padded over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. "This," she murmured. "This is what I wanted without knowing how to name it." "What's that?" Darius asked, turning in her arms. Someone who sees Sunday morning as something worth sharing, not just another day on the calendar. They spent the morning slowly, drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. Darius told her about his plans to expand his business, maybe hire another worker so he could take on more clients. Eleanor shared her ideas for a new series of paintings exploring the concept of transformation, butterflies emerging from cocoons, phoenixes rising from ashes, women finding their voices. Later, they walked to the farmer's market down the street, something Eleanor had never done during her marriage. Richard had considered such places beneath them, preferring to have everything delivered or shopping only at exclusive boutiques. But Eleanor loved the bustling energy, the vendors calling out their wares, the scent of fresh bread and ripe fruit mixing with the morning air. She watched Darius haggle good-naturedly with a vendor over the price of tomatoes, saw him laugh and shake hands when they reached an agreement, noticed how he treated everyone with the same respect regardless of who they were. This was integrity, she realized. This was character. All of Richard's wealth and status couldn't buy what Darius had naturally, a fundamental decency that showed in every interaction. They walked home with their bags of fresh produce, Darius telling her about a dish his mother used to make, promising to cook it for her. Eleanor felt a pang of sadness that she'd never get to meet the woman who'd raised such a good man, but also gratitude that her influence lived on through him. That afternoon, while Darius worked on fixing a wobbly table leg in her apartment, Eleanor painted. She was working on a piece for her upcoming show, a diptych showing the same woman in two different worlds. On the left panel, she stood in a grand room, perfectly dressed and made up, but her face was blank, empty, a beautiful shell. On the right panel, she stood in a modest space, paint-stained clothes and messy hair, but her eyes were alive, her expression fierce and joyful. Darius came to look over her shoulder as she worked, his presence warm and solid behind her. "That's you, isn't it?" he said softly. "Both versions." Eleanor nodded. "I need to remember where I came from. Need to remind myself why I chose this path, even when it gets hard. And has it been? Hard, I mean?" Eleanor set down her brush, turning to face him. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I miss having money for things I want instead of just things I need. I miss not worrying about the electric bill or whether my car will make it another month. I miss the ease of that life." She paused, taking his hands in hers. "But I don't miss feeling like a ghost in my own life. I don't miss pretending to be someone I'm not. I don't miss the loneliness of being with someone who never really saw me." Darius pulled her close, and Eleanor breathed him in, this man who'd helped her remember how to be herself. The weeks that followed were a study in contrasts. Eleanor's days were full of honest work, of creative struggle and triumph, of building something real with her own hands. Her paintings grew bolder, more confident. Maya started fielding serious inquiries from collectors who'd seen Eleanor's work, people willing to pay real money for her pieces. One evening, Eleanor got a call that changed everything. A major gallery in San Francisco wanted to feature her work in a group show of emerging artists, pieces that explored themes of transformation and rebirth. It was the kind of opportunity that could launch a career, that could mean financial stability doing what she loved. She called Darius immediately, her hands shaking with excitement. He answered on the second ring, and she could hear the sounds of his work in the background, water running, equipment humming. "They want me," she said breathlessly. "The gallery in San Francisco. They want 6 pieces for their show in September. Eleanor, that's incredible." Darius's voice was warm with pride. "I knew it would happen. Your work is too powerful for people to ignore." But there was something else in his tone, something that made Eleanor pause. "What is it?" she asked. Darius was quiet for a moment. "Nothing, really. I'm just proud of you. You've worked so hard for this." But Eleanor heard what he wasn't saying, heard the hint of worry beneath the pride. She understood it, even shared it. Success meant change, meant new opportunities, but also new challenges. It meant their simple life together might become complicated. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out together." That night, lying in Darius's arms once again, Eleanor thought about the future with a mix of excitement and trepidation. She was building a career, yes, but more importantly, she was building a life, a real life, authentic and chosen, filled with love and purpose, and the daily courage of being exactly who she was meant to be. And as she drifted off to sleep in Darius's arms, surrounded by her art in her small but precious space, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right trade. Because freedom, real freedom, was worth more than all of Richard's money could ever buy. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in a Portland gallery, her second show opening to a larger crowd. Critics were noticing her work. Art collectors were starting to remember her name. She was building a career entirely her own, brick by brick, painting by painting, brave choice by brave choice. The gallery walls held 12 new pieces, each one a chapter in her story of transformation. There was the self-portrait she'd painted in Richard's house, the woman reaching for something just beyond her grasp. There was the cliff painting, the woman falling and flying, the diptych showing her two lives side by side. And there were new works too, pieces that showed not just pain and struggle, but joy and hope, and the fierce beauty of choosing yourself. One painting in particular drew crowds. It showed a pool, crystal clear water reflecting a perfect blue sky, but in the depth swam two figures, reaching for each other across the divide of water and air, their fingers almost touching. Eleanor had titled it simply Salvation, and people stood before it in silence, understanding instinctively the story it told. A critic from art forums stood beside it, making notes in a leather journal. Eleanor watched from across the room, her heart racing. Reviews could make or break an artist's career, especially one as new to the scene as she was. Maya appeared at her elbow, champagne flute in hand. "Breathe," she whispered. "Your work speaks for itself. You don't need their approval, but you're going to get it anyway." And she was right. By the end of the evening, Eleanor had sold 8 of the 12 pieces. The art forum critic had pulled her aside for a brief interview, asking thoughtful questions about her technique, her inspiration, the journey that had led her to this moment. Eleanor answered honestly, speaking about transformation and courage and the price of authenticity. When the last guests finally filtered out and the gallery grew quiet, Eleanor found herself alone with the 4 remaining paintings. Maya had discreetly disappeared to give her this moment, understanding that an artist needed time with their work, especially on a night like this. Eleanor walked slowly from piece to piece, remembering the moment she'd created each one. The raw emotion that had poured through her brush, the tears that had fallen onto canvas, the hope that had sustained her through the difficult months of rebuilding her life. She stopped in front of Salvation, the pool painting that had resonated so deeply with viewers. Looking at it now, Eleanor saw something she hadn't consciously intended when she painted it. The two figures weren't just reaching for each other. They were already touching, their fingertips meeting at the boundary between water and air. Connection was possible, even across seemingly impossible divides. Beautiful, isn't it? Eleanor turned to find an older woman standing behind her, elegantly dressed in a way that spoke of old money and refined taste. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in a classic chignon, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating art. "It's my favorite piece in the show," the woman continued, stepping closer. "Though I have to admit, they're all quite powerful. You have a rare gift, Ms. Brooks, the ability to paint truth without sentimentality. That's harder than most people realize." "Thank you," Eleanor said, studying the woman's face. She looked familiar somehow, though Eleanor couldn't place where she might have seen her before. The woman extended her hand. "Marguerite Bellamy. I own the Bellamy Gallery in San Francisco." Eleanor's breath caught. The Bellamy Gallery was legendary, one of the most prestigious contemporary art venues on the West Coast. Marguerite Bellamy herself was known for discovering and championing artists who went on to have major careers. "I'd like to offer you a solo show," Marguerite said, her tone matter-of-fact despite the magnitude of the offer. 6 months from now, 20 pieces. We'll provide you with a stipend to cover your living expenses while you work, so you can focus entirely on creating. Eleanor felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the opportunity being handed to her. This was beyond anything she'd dared to dream. A solo show at Bellamy Gallery could establish her as a serious artist, could mean financial stability, could validate everything she'd sacrificed to get here. "I don't know what to say," Eleanor managed. Marguerite smiled, the expression softening her austere features. "Say yes. Then go home and start painting. I'll have my assistant contact you tomorrow with the details." After Marguerite left, Eleanor stood in the empty gallery, trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed with a text from Darius. "How's it going? Proud of you no matter what." Eleanor smiled, her fingers moving across the screen. "It's going better than I ever imagined. Wait until I tell you." She found him waiting outside the gallery, leaning against his truck despite the light drizzle that had started to fall. He straightened when he saw her, his face breaking into that smile she loved, the one that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Saul?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "So," Eleanor said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Marguerite Bellamy wants to give me a solo show in San Francisco. 6 months from now, 20 pieces, with a stipend so I can paint full-time." Darius pulled back to look at her, his hands on her shoulders. "Eleanor, that's incredible. That's everything you've worked for." But instead of pure joy, Eleanor saw something complicated in his expression. Pride, yes, but also worry. She understood it. Success would mean change. Would mean her spending months focused entirely on painting. Would mean their time together becoming even more precious and scarce. Would mean her potentially outgrowing this life they'd built together. "Hey," she said softly, reaching up to cup his face. "This doesn't change us. You know that, right?" Darius was quiet for a moment, rain beginning to dampen his hair. "I know you believe that. I just hope it's true." The vulnerability at his voice broke her heart. She pulled him down for a kiss, pouring all her certainty, all her love, all her commitment into it. When they parted, she pressed her forehead to his. "I spent 12 years with a man who saw me as an accessory to his success," she said firmly. "I will never do that to you. We're partners, Darius. Equals. Your dreams matter just as much as mine." He kissed her again, softer this time, believing her because he had to, because the alternative was too painful to consider. They drove back to her apartment through the rain, and Eleanor felt the weight of the evening settling over her. Joy and fear intertwined, excitement and anxiety dancing together. She'd gotten everything she wanted, but now she had to figure out how to keep it without losing what mattered most. That night, wrapped in Darius's arms, Eleanor made a silent promise. She would paint her truth, yes. She would build her career and claim her place in the art world. But she would never forget the man who'd helped her find her voice, who'd stood beside her through the hardest parts of her transformation, who loved her not for what she could become but for who she already was. The rain continued outside, washing the city clean once again. And Eleanor held tight to the man who'd saved her not by rescuing her, but by believing she could rescue herself. Darius stood in the corner, watching her interact with collectors, pride evident in every line of his face. He'd dressed up for the occasion, trading his usual work clothes for slacks and a button-down shirt, but Eleanor loved him just as much either way. Maybe more in his work clothes, actually, because they represented his honesty, his refusal to be anything other than exactly who he was. During a quiet moment, he pulled her aside, away from the crowd that was growing larger as the evening progressed. "Look at you," he said softly, his eyes warm with love and admiration. "Making your dreams real." Eleanor looked around at her paintings on the walls, at the red dots appearing next to sold pieces, at the people responding to her work with genuine emotion. She looked at the life she'd built from the ashes of her old one, the career she was creating through talent and determination, the love she'd found with a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a trophy. "Our dreams," she corrected, taking his hand, "because you're part of everything good that's happened. You believed in me when I'd forgotten how to believe in myself." He kissed her softly, not caring who saw, not caring that people would talk, that the art world would notice and remember. And Eleanor kissed him back, free and unashamed, no longer hiding, no longer pretending, no longer anything but exactly who she was meant to be. The woman who'd been invisible in her own life had finally found her voice, and she was never going silent again.